When Arthur turned 80, the candles on his birthday cake seemed more like tiny reminders of borrowed time than cheerful flames of celebration. Everyone clapped around him, children, grandchildren, even a few neighbors who had known him since his younger days, but he noticed how their applause carried a certain hesitance. They were smiling, yes, but behind their smiles lurked an awareness, an unspoken thought. Arthur was 80 now, and life was not going to be the same anymore. He leaned forward, blowing out the candles in a single breath, and the room filled with laughter and cheers. Yet in that very moment, Arthur felt the first of many surprises life after 80 would offer. That joy became fragile, delicate like a porcelain teacup that could shatter at the lightest touch. His body was tired even after sitting most of the day. His knees ached though he had barely walked across the living room. And when he laughed with his grandchildren, he realized he could not quite hear their giggles without leaning in. Later that evening, when the guests had left and the house returned to its hollow silence, Arthur sat in his armchair by the window. The night outside was still, except for the rustle of leaves swaying against the streetlights. He thought about how, when he was younger, nights were full of plans, late dinners, movies, impromptu car rides with his wife Margaret. Now, nights stretched long, silent, and unforgiving, reminding him of the hours he had to spend with his thoughts. Margaret had been gone for 6 years. That loss had carved a hollow space inside him, one that birthdays and family visits could not fill. At 74, he had still managed to convince himself that life could hold surprises, new beginnings even. But at 80, he realized another truth: the world grows smaller. Friends passed away one by one, and those who remained were either too sick to visit or living with their own families far away. His phone rang less, his days became quieter, and even in a house full of family, he often felt invisible. That night, Arthur picked up a photo album from the side table. His trembling hands flipped through pages filled with frozen smiles. There he was in his 30s, standing proudly with Margaret by the seaside. There were the children, toddlers then, now grown with children of their own. Each photograph was like a door to another time, but the doors were locked. He could not step inside, only peer through the glass of memory. And with every page turned, he felt both warmth and loneliness. The next morning, Arthur woke to the sound of birds outside his window. He stretched, but his body resisted. His back stiffened, and it took him nearly 5 minutes to swing his legs over the side of the bed. He muttered under his breath, "Didn't get easier, that's for sure." He remembered how people used to say, "Life gets softer as you age, you've earned your rest." But this was not rest. This was a battlefield with his own body. Simple tasks like buttoning his shirt or bending to tie his shoelaces became challenges that left him frustrated. Breakfast was another quiet affair. He made tea, but the kettle felt heavier than it used to. The toast burned because he forgot to pull it out in time. Margaret used to tease him for being clumsy in the kitchen, but now, without her, every mistake felt like proof that he was slipping. He ate slowly, staring at the empty chair across the table. Sometimes he spoke to it, softly, as if Margaret might still be listening. Later, his daughter Emily stopped by with her youngest, Daniel. The boy ran around the living room, full of life and laughter, while Emily tidied up the kitchen. "Dad, you really should let me hire someone to help you," she said gently. Arthur frowned. "I can manage. I've managed all my life." But even as he said it, his eyes drifted to the broom leaning in the corner. He had meant to sweep the floor 3 days ago, but the strength had not come. Emily gave him a look he knew too well, half concern, half helplessness. "I just don't want you to overdo it," she said. He nodded but did not reply. Inside, he felt a sting of pride. To accept help meant admitting he was no longer capable, and he wasn't ready to surrender that yet. When they left, the silence returned. He turned on the television, but the voices blurred together. He wasn't interested in the news anymore, it felt like a world that had moved on without him. Instead, he sat in his chair, staring at the patterns of sunlight on the carpet. That was when the second surprise of life after 80 dawned on him. Time was no longer a river rushing forward, it was a stagnant pond. Days blended into one another, with little to distinguish Monday from Friday, summer from autumn. In the afternoon, Arthur decided to take a short walk to the park. He wore his hat, grabbed his cane, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of grass and distant flowers. As he walked slowly down the path, children played on swings, joggers passed by, and couples sat on benches. He felt both part of the scene and apart from it. He noticed people's eyes sometimes flicker toward him, sympathy, perhaps, or maybe just acknowledgement of age. On one bench sat his old friend Harold, hunched over but smiling when he saw Arthur. "Well, look who's still alive," Harold chuckled. They laughed, though both knew there was truth in the jest. The two men sat together, exchanging memories of their youth. Harold spoke of his granddaughter's wedding, Arthur spoke of his grandson's new job. Yet beneath their words was an undercurrent of loss. They talked not about the future, but about the past, because the past was where their stories truly lived now. When Arthur returned home, the sun was setting. He brewed another cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. He thought about how each day now felt like both a gift and a burden. A gift because he still breathed, still felt, still remembered. A burden because the weight of loneliness, the aches of his body, and the shrinking circle of his world pressed on him constantly. As night fell again, he whispered to himself, "They said it would get easier. But nobody told me the truth. Nobody said life after 80 is full of surprises you don't want, surprises that test your patience, your dignity, your will." And so, his journey after 80 began, not with peace, but with the realization that aging was not a gentle slope into rest, but a steep climb into challenges he had never imagined. Arthur's days after his 80th birthday fell into a rhythm that looked steady on the surface but felt unstable beneath. Each morning began with the same slow battle against his own body, and each evening ended with silence that seemed to grow heavier with time. Yet life after 80 had its own way of surprising him, and those surprises were not always cruel. Some carried bittersweet lessons, others revealed truths he had ignored for decades. One afternoon, while sorting through an old drawer, Arthur came across letters from Margaret. They were not love letters, not exactly, more like notes she had left him during their 40 years together. Some were scribbled reminders about groceries, others were playful lines teasing him for forgetting their anniversary once, and a few were raw confessions of how much she leaned on him during the tough years. Reading them, Arthur realized something unsettling. He had forgotten the sound of her voice. He could picture her face in photographs, even recall her favorite perfume, but her laughter, once the music of his life, had slipped into silence. The realization hit him like a wave, and for the first time in months, tears rolled freely down his cheeks. That was when the next surprise struck him. Grief did not soften with time. People told him, back when Margaret passed, that time heals all wounds. They were wrong. Time didn't heal, it reshaped grief into something quieter, but no less heavy. It lived with him in the corners of the house, in the empty chair at the table, in the space beside him in bed. Sometimes it shouted, sometimes it whispered, but it never left. The following week, Emily convinced Arthur to visit a senior community center nearby. "You'll meet people your age, Dad," she insisted. "It might do you good." Arthur resisted at first. He didn't want to be lumped into a group defined only by age. But curiosity and Emily's persistence finally won. He dressed in his best cardigan and let her drive him there. The center was lively, filled with chatter and movement. Groups of elderly men and women played cards, painted canvases, or attended a chair yoga class. At first, Arthur felt out of place, a stranger intruding on a club he hadn't asked to join. But then he noticed something unexpected. These people laughed. They joked about their bad knees, teased each other about memory lapses, and seemed almost defiant in their cheerfulness. A woman named Grace approached him. She was 78, sharp-eyed and quick-witted. "You look like you're thinking too hard," she said with a smile. Arthur chuckled nervously. "Maybe I am." Grace invited him to join her group for tea, and for the first time in a long while, Arthur found himself talking freely. They spoke of books, music, and even politics, though his hearing forced him to lean in more than he'd like. That day, Arthur realized another truth: loneliness is not always about being alone. It's about being unseen. At the center, among people who understood the weight of years, he felt visible again. Yet even that came with its own surprise. He noticed how quickly conversations turned to loss, illness, and absent friends. Every story carried shadows. It was as though they were all holding candles in the dark, grateful for the light but painfully aware of the surrounding night. Back home, Arthur reflected on this. He began visiting the center twice a week, drawn to the companionship but wary of the reminders of mortality. Harold joined him once, but after 2 visits, he admitted it was too much for him. "Too many ghosts walking around," Harold said. Arthur couldn't disagree. Meanwhile, Arthur's relationship with his family evolved in ways he hadn't anticipated. Emily called more often, sometimes to check on him, sometimes just to chat. His son, David, who lived 2 states away, began sending him small packages, books, puzzles, even a new sweater for the winter. These gestures warmed Arthur, but they also revealed another surprise. At 80, the roles between parent and child reversed. The protectors became the protected, the givers became receivers. It was humbling, even disorienting. One evening, Daniel, his youngest grandson, stayed over. The boy was only 10, curious and full of energy. He peppered Arthur with questions about his childhood, about what life was like before phones and the internet. Arthur found himself telling stories he hadn't spoken of in years, running through fields barefoot, building wooden toys with his father, courting Margaret under the oak tree in the old neighborhood. Daniel listened wide-eyed, as though Arthur's life was an adventure book. And in that moment, Arthur discovered a rare joy. His memories were not just fading relics. They were bridges, connecting generations, giving his life meaning. Beyond the aches and silences. But joy never came without its counterpart. A few days later, Arthur suffered a fall in the kitchen. He had bent down to pick up a dropped spoon, lost his balance, and crumpled to the floor. The pain in his hip was sharp, but sharper still was the humiliation. He lay there for minutes, helpless, before managing to pull himself up with the support of a chair. His pride took a deeper bruise than his body. When Emily found out, she was shaken. "Dad, this is serious. You need someone here with you." Arthur resisted, but he could see the fear in her eyes. For her, he agreed to keep a mobile phone in his pocket at all times, in case of emergencies. But inside, he wrestled with the realization that independence, his most cherished possession, was slipping away. In the weeks that followed, he moved more carefully, more slowly. He noticed how every step, every reach, carried risk. The world had become hazardous in ways he had never imagined. A rug on the floor became a trap, a staircase a mountain, even the shower a battlefield. Life after 80 was not just about living, it was about surviving the small, constant threats of fragility. Yet, amidst these struggles, Arthur also began to see beauty in the smallest of things. A sparrow pecking at crumbs near his window, the laughter of children passing by, the warmth of sunlight on his face, these moments carried weight they never had before. He realized that when big adventures were no longer possible, life offered small wonders instead. The trick was noticing them. One late evening, as he sat by the window with a cup of tea, Arthur whispered aloud, "Maybe it didn't get easier." Maybe it was never meant to. Maybe the challenge is the point. He thought of Margaret, of the years they had shared, of the grief and love intertwined. He thought of his children, his grandchildren, and even his new acquaintances at the center. Life after 80 was not simple, but it was still life. Still breath. Still stories waiting to be told. The days continued, uneven but precious. Arthur carried with him both the weight of loss and the spark of presence. Each surprise, grief's persistence, friendship's fragility, family's reversal, the dangers of independence, the beauty of small things, became part of his journey. And though he often muttered that it didn't get easier, deep down he knew, the very struggle gave shape to the days that remained. Arthur's third winter after turning 80 arrived with an unexpected sharpness. The cold seeped deeper into his bones than before, and no matter how high he turned the heater, a chill lingered inside him. He found himself layering sweaters and scarves indoors, and even then, his fingers trembled as he tried to grip a teacup. He realized then another cruel surprise of aging: the body was no longer his to command. It set its own rules, and he had no choice but to obey. The days grew shorter, darkness falling before he had even finished his evening tea. That darkness was not only outside the window but inside the house too. He noticed how the silence felt heavier in winter, how the walls seemed to close in. He missed the warmth of Margaret more fiercely than ever. She used to hum softly while knitting or reading, filling the air with life. Now, the house felt like a museum, where every object was a relic of what once was. One evening, while rummaging through an old chest, Arthur found Margaret's knitted scarf. It still held her faint scent, though he wondered if it was real or something his heart conjured. He wrapped it around his neck, closed his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, he was not 80, not alone, he was simply a husband sitting beside his wife, safe in the warmth of their shared life. Tears came again, uninvited yet familiar. At 80, tears were never far from the surface. But life, in its strange way, refused to let him remain in grief. Daniel, his youngest grandson, began visiting more frequently after school. Sometimes the boy brought homework and spread it across the kitchen table. Other times he came simply to talk. Arthur marveled at the boy's curiosity, the way he asked about wars Arthur had lived through, about the inventions that changed the world during his lifetime, about what it felt like to grow old. The questions were sometimes awkward, but Arthur answered with honesty. "It feels like carrying two versions of yourself," he told him once. One that remembers running freely, and one that struggles to climb stairs. Both are you, and they never quite agree with each other. Through Daniel's visits, Arthur discovered something else: children have a way of making age invisible. For a child, a grandparent is not old or fragile, he is simply the keeper of stories, the bridge to a past they cannot see themselves. Arthur found purpose in this role. He began writing little notes about his memories, his first bicycle, his first job, the night Margaret said yes when he proposed. He planned to give them to his grandchildren one day, hoping they would carry pieces of him forward when he could no longer tell the stories himself. Yet even as he found purpose, his body reminded him of its fragility. One bitterly cold morning, he woke with pain in his chest. Panic surged through him as he clutched the side of the bed. After several long minutes, the pain eased, but fear lingered. He told no one, not even Emily, unwilling to cause worry. But from that day onward, he lived with the quiet awareness that time was shorter than he wanted to admit. Every cup of tea, every sunrise, every laugh with Daniel became sharper, brighter, as though lit by the urgency of dwindling days. The community center remained a small refuge. Grace, the woman with sharp eyes and witty remarks, had become a friend he looked forward to seeing. They often sat together, sharing tea or playing chess, though Arthur admitted he was a terrible player. Grace teased him for it, and he enjoyed the banter more than he cared to admit. There was no romance between them. Arthur's heart still belonged to Margaret, but companionship of any kind was a balm. With Grace, he didn't feel invisible. With Grace, he was simply Arthur. But even the community center carried its shadows. One afternoon, Arthur arrived to find the mood somber. One of the regulars, a cheerful man who loved to sing old songs, had passed away suddenly. The news hit him harder than expected. He realized then another painful truth: after 80, loss became routine. Friends disappeared, neighbors were gone, and every goodbye carried the weight of finality. It was not the fear of his own death that troubled Arthur most, it was the accumulation of absences, the shrinking circle of people who remembered him as he truly was. As winter dragged on, Emily grew more insistent about hiring help for him. "Dad, you can't keep pretending you're fine," she said one evening after finding him struggling to open a jar. "It's not weakness to accept care." Arthur bristled but stayed silent. Deep inside, he knew she was right. Pride and fear wrestled inside him, pride that wanted to remain independent, fear that he might not be able to manage much longer. That night, he dreamt of Margaret. In the dream, she sat across the table, her knitting needles clicking softly. She looked at him with that same patient smile she always had when he was being stubborn. "Arthur," she said, "you've carried enough. Let others carry you now." He woke with tears wetting his cheeks, but also with a strange calmness. Maybe, he thought, accepting help was not defeat but another way of loving his family, by letting them love him back. Spring eventually pushed winter away, and with it came small renewals. Arthur began sitting in the garden more often, letting sunlight soak into his skin. He noticed flowers blooming, birds nesting, children riding bikes along the street. Life outside his window carried on with a vigor that contrasted sharply with the slowness of his own days. Yet watching it, he felt connected, as though he was still part of the world, even if at a slower rhythm. One afternoon, Emily brought over an old record player she had found in the attic. "Thought you might like this, Dad," she said. Arthur's eyes lit up as he carefully placed a record on it, Frank Sinatra, one of Margaret's favorites. As the familiar melody filled the room, memories cascaded over him. He and Margaret dancing in the living room, their children laughing nearby, late-night talks that stretched until dawn. The music wrapped around him like an embrace, both tender and bittersweet. Later that evening, Daniel asked him, "Grandpa, if you could be any age again, what would you choose?" Arthur thought for a long moment before replying, "I wouldn't choose. Every age had its struggles and its joys. Even now, at 80, life still has its gifts. I think the trick is not wishing to be younger, but learning how to be here." Daniel frowned. "But isn't it hard?" Arthur smiled. "Yes, hard, but not empty." As the months passed, Arthur continued navigating the contradictions of life after 80, the loneliness and the companionship, the fragility and the resilience, the grief and the small joys. He muttered often, half in jest, "Didn't get easier," yet deep inside he recognized that maybe it wasn't supposed to. Maybe the difficulty was what gave these last years their sharpness, their poignancy, their truth. And so, each day became both a burden and a blessing, each surprise a reminder that living, at any age, was never simple. But as Arthur sat one evening with the record spinning Sinatra's voice into the fading light, he realized that even at 80, even with all its struggles, life still had the power to move him, to make him grateful, to make him feel alive. Summer arrived with a brightness that seemed almost too harsh for Arthur's aging eyes. The days stretched long, the sun blazing through his curtains early each morning, pulling him from uneasy sleep. He found himself rising earlier than he used to, not because he wanted to, but because his body no longer allowed the luxury of rest. Sleep had become light, fractured, easily broken by the sound of a creaking floor or the hoot of an owl. Another surprise of life after 80, he thought bitterly, restless nights followed by weary mornings. On one of those mornings, Arthur sat on the porch with a cup of lukewarm tea, watching the neighborhood stir awake. Children ran past with bicycles, mothers hurried with strollers, men jogged by with earphones tucked into their ears. The world seemed to move faster than he could follow, leaving him behind. Yet, in that slowness, he noticed details others missed: the way sunlight touched the leaves, the soft hum of bees moving between flowers, the smell of freshly cut grass. Perhaps that was another truth of aging. When the body slowed, the world revealed itself more quietly. Emily stopped by later that day, her brow furrowed in that way Arthur recognized all too well. "Dad, I've been thinking," she began cautiously, "maybe it's time we consider assisted living." The words landed like stones in Arthur's chest. He stared at her, stunned. "You want to put me in a home?" His voice cracked, more from hurt than anger. "No, not like that," Emily said quickly, reaching for his hand. "It's just, I worry about you being alone. You deserve care, and you'd still have your independence, but with help nearby." Arthur pulled his hand away. "This is my home. Every wall, every picture frame, every creak in the floor, Margaret is here. You'd take me away from that." His voice was sharp, but beneath it lay a plea she could not ignore. Emily sighed, guilt flashing across her face. "I only want what's best for you." That night, Arthur sat alone in his armchair, the conversation replaying in his mind. Assisted living. The thought terrified him, not just because it meant leaving his home, but because it meant surrendering completely to age. It meant admitting he could no longer live on his own terms. He whispered into the empty room, "Not yet, Margaret. Not yet." A few weeks later, Grace invited him to a summer picnic organized by the community center. Arthur hesitated but eventually agreed. When he arrived, he was surprised by the liveliness. Tables covered with checkered cloths, plates piled with sandwiches and fruit, music playing softly through a speaker. Elderly men and women sat under umbrellas, laughing, sharing stories, even dancing slowly to old tunes. Arthur felt a tug in his chest. This was not just survival, this was living. Grace introduced him to her friends, and soon Arthur found himself laughing more than he had in months. He even joined in a game of dominoes, fumbling with the tiles but enjoying the camaraderie. For a moment, he forgot the heaviness of his age, the loneliness of his home. For a moment, he felt human again, not just an old man counting days. But as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the park, he saw an older woman sitting alone on a bench, her eyes vacant. She stared at the laughter around her but did not join. Arthur recognized that look. It was the look of someone whose body was present but whose spirit was drifting. It reminded him of his own darker days. He approached her gently, sat beside her, and said softly, "It's hard sometimes, isn't it?" She turned to him slowly, her eyes filling with tears, and simply nodded. They did not speak more, but the silence between them carried understanding. Arthur realized then another cruel surprise of aging. No matter how surrounded you were, the loneliness never completely left. When he returned home that evening, the house felt quieter than usual, as if punishing him for having laughed elsewhere. He brewed tea and sat with the record player humming in the background. Margaret's absence pressed heavier, as though she too had watched him enjoying the picnic and now demanded to be remembered. He closed his eyes, whispering, "I haven't forgotten you. I never could." The following week brought another challenge. His eyesight, already dim, began to blur more often. Reading became exhausting, newspapers too small to decipher without a magnifying glass. Even faces sometimes appeared as shifting outlines before sharpening slowly. Arthur knew he should see a doctor, but the truth frightened him. Losing sight meant losing independence, losing the last freedom he clung to. He delayed making the appointment, choosing instead to squint harder, pretend longer. One evening, Daniel noticed his struggle. "Grandpa, why are you holding the book so close?" Arthur smiled weakly. These old eyes, they're just tired. Daniel frowned. You should get them checked. I don't want you to stop reading to me. The boy's words pierced him. That night, Arthur promised himself he would go, not for himself, but for Daniel. The appointment confirmed his fears, cataracts. The doctor assured him surgery could help, but Arthur heard only the reminder that his body was failing piece by piece. Still, he agreed. The procedure was scheduled, and Emily insisted on accompanying him. The night before, Arthur sat awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought of all he had seen in his lifetime: wars, weddings, births, funerals, triumphs, heartbreaks. The idea of losing sight terrified him, but the thought of not seeing Daniel's face, Emily's kindness, the sunlight through his window, that terrified him more. The surgery went well, and within weeks, the world sharpened again. Colors seemed brighter, words clearer, faces more defined. It was as though life had granted him a small reprieve, a chance to keep seeing the beauty he had nearly lost. He felt grateful in a way he hadn't in years. But gratitude carried its own sting. He knew this gift was temporary. His body would continue its decline, no matter how many small victories came. As summer turned toward autumn, Arthur found himself reflecting more often. He realized the surprises of life after 80 were not just hardships, they were also lessons. Grief taught him love's endurance. Loneliness taught him the value of connection. Fragility taught him to notice beauty in small things. Fear taught him gratitude. None of it was easy, but perhaps ease had never been the point. One late autumn evening, as the sky glowed in streaks of gold and crimson, Arthur sat with Daniel on the porch. The boy leaned against him, asking endless questions about life, death, and everything in between. Finally, Daniel asked, "Grandpa, are you scared of getting older?" Arthur looked out at the horizon, his heart heavy yet strangely calm. "I used to be," he admitted. "But now, I think I'm more scared of not living while I still can." That's the real surprise, Daniel. Even when it's hard, life still wants to be lived. Daniel was quiet for a long moment before whispering, "I'm glad you're still here." Arthur smiled, resting his trembling hand over the boy's. "So am I, Daniel. So am I." And as the last light of day slipped away, Arthur understood that though life after 80 did not get easier, it still held enough love, enough laughter, enough memory, to keep him moving forward, one fragile, stubborn step at a time. Winter crept back into Arthur's life like an old adversary he could never quite defeat. The days grew shorter again, nights longer, and with them came a deeper heaviness. The cold settled into his bones with a persistence that no blanket could fight off. His joints ached more fiercely, his movements slowed further, and even the simple act of climbing into bed felt like scaling a mountain. At 81 now, he could no longer deny the truth that weighed on him daily. Each year after 80 was not simply time passing, but a narrowing of possibilities. Emily visited more frequently, bringing groceries, tidying the kitchen, making sure he ate enough. Arthur appreciated her care but sometimes bristled at her fussing. He wanted to tell her, "I'm still your father, not your child," but the words always softened before they left his lips. He knew she wasn't trying to take away his dignity, she was trying to preserve what was left of it. That realization humbled him, even when pride pushed back. One snowy morning, Arthur woke to the sound of the wind rattling the windows. The house felt colder than usual, and as he shuffled into the kitchen, he discovered the furnace had gone out. Panic fluttered in his chest. In his younger years, he would have fixed it himself, or at least called a repairman without hesitation. Now, standing there in his slippers with cold seeping into his feet, he felt small, helpless. He fumbled for the phone, his hands shaking, and called Emily. She arrived quickly, bundled in her coat, her face flushed with worry. "Dad, you can't stay here in this cold," she said firmly. "Come to my house for a few days until it's fixed." Arthur resisted, as always. This is my home. Emily's eyes softened but her voice remained steady. And I want you safe. Please, Dad. He relented, not because he wanted to, but because he saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear Margaret used to carry when she worried about him. At Emily's house, Arthur slept in the guest room. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow, photographs of his grandchildren lined the shelves, and the warmth of family filled the air. Yet he could not shake the feeling of being a guest in his own daughter's life. That night, lying awake in a strange bed, Arthur whispered to the dark, "Margaret, I don't belong anywhere anymore, not even in my own skin." Tears slipped silently onto the pillow, unseen by anyone. The next morning, Daniel burst into his room, full of energy. "Grandpa, want to play chess?" Arthur smiled despite his weariness. The boy set up the board and chattered away as they played, though Arthur barely followed the game. He lost quickly, but Daniel didn't seem to mind. For the boy, it wasn't about winning, it was about sharing time. And for Arthur, that was enough. Back at his own house days later, Arthur found himself staring at the walls, noticing how empty they seemed without Margaret's presence. He realized then another surprise of aging. Houses don't grow old with you, they outlive you. The rooms that once echoed with laughter now whispered only of absence. The photos on the shelves seemed to mock him, reminding him of days that would never return. One afternoon, Grace visited. She carried a small tin of cookies she had baked. "Thought you could use some company," she said with a smile. Arthur welcomed her into the kitchen, and they sat together, sipping tea. Grace spoke of her own struggles, lonely nights, aching knees, the fear of becoming a burden. Arthur listened, and for the first time, he felt less alone in his worries. They laughed at their shared frustrations, cried at their shared losses. Companionship, he realized, was not about fixing loneliness but about sharing it. Later, after Grace left, Arthur lingered on her words. She had said, "We're all just trying to find pieces of joy in the cracks." He thought about that all evening. Maybe life after 80 wasn't about chasing big dreams anymore. Maybe it was about finding light in the smallest corners, a warm cookie, a friendly conversation, a grandson's laughter. But life had more tests for him. One evening, as he reached for a book on the shelf, dizziness struck. The room spun, his knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor. Pain shot through his side, and for several minutes he lay there, gasping, too weak to move. With trembling hands, he reached for the phone in his pocket and dialed Emily. She arrived within minutes, her face pale, her hands shaking. The doctor later confirmed it was nothing catastrophic, just a fainting spell, but the warning was clear. His body was growing frailer by the day. After that incident, Emily grew more insistent about assisted living. "Dad, I can't lose sleep every night wondering if you're safe. Please, at least think about it." Arthur sat silently, staring at his hands. They were thin now, veins visible, skin loose. He thought about Margaret, about how she would have wanted him safe. He thought about Daniel, about how much he still wanted to see him grow. Slowly, reluctantly, Arthur whispered, "I'll think about it." But in his heart, he knew thinking about it was the first step toward surrender. Days passed, and Arthur found himself reflecting more deeply. He realized that life after 80 was not only about physical decline, it was about identity. Who was he now, without work, without Margaret, with fewer friends each year? He was a collection of memories, yes, but was that enough? He began writing more often, filling pages with stories of his youth. His marriage, his children. Perhaps, he thought, if he could no longer live fully in the present, he could at least leave behind a map of where he had been. One evening, as he wrote, Daniel sat beside him. "Grandpa, are you writing a book?" Arthur chuckled. "Not a book. Just pieces of me." Daniel looked at him seriously. "I'll read every word." In that moment, Arthur felt something stir inside him, a sense of purpose, however small. Perhaps his life after 80 was not meant to be easier, but it was still meant to matter. As winter deepened, Arthur found comfort in routine. Tea in the morning, short walks when the weather allowed, visits from Emily, phone calls from David, chess with Daniel, tea with Grace. The days were simple, repetitive, but not empty. He learned to cherish them, fragile as they were. And yet, every night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he whispered the same words, "Didn't get easier." Sometimes he said it with bitterness, sometimes with humor, sometimes with quiet acceptance. It became his truth, his mantra, his way of naming the strange, difficult, beautiful journey of life after 80. Spring crept back into the world, slow and hesitant, like a child learning to walk. The snow melted in patches, revealing damp earth and the first stubborn shoots of green pushing through. Arthur sat by the window most mornings now, a blanket draped across his legs, watching as life returned outside while his own seemed to retreat further inward. He had grown thinner, his hands trembled more, and his eyes, though still bright with curiosity, carried a weight of weariness that no sleep could lift. Yet even in the frailty of his body, his mind wandered through decades, pulling up memories as though they were blooming once again. Margaret's laughter in the garden, Emily's first day of school, David running down the street with a kite tugging the sky behind him. These images lived inside him more vividly than the faces he now saw in the mirror. Emily noticed the changes too. She had begun stopping by daily, sometimes with Daniel, sometimes just to sit in silence with him. She often brought meals he hardly touched, but he ate a little to ease her worry. She spoke of her work, her children's lives, the small dramas of daily living, and Arthur listened gratefully, knowing that to hear the rhythm of her life was to feel still tethered to the world. One evening, Emily stayed longer than usual. The clock ticked steadily in the quiet room, and she finally asked the question that had lingered on her lips for months. "Dad," she said softly, "are you afraid?" Arthur looked at her, his daughter who had once clutched his hand crossing the street, now holding his heart together with her presence. He smiled faintly. "Sometimes. Not of what comes next, but of leaving you behind." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. "You've given me enough love for a lifetime, Dad. You don't have to be afraid of that." Arthur reached out, his frail hand resting on hers. "Then promise me you'll keep living fully. Don't let my absence turn into your prison." She nodded, unable to speak, her tears slipping silently down her cheeks. That night, Arthur dreamed of Margaret. She stood in their old kitchen, sunlight pouring through the windows, her hands busy at the counter as she hummed softly. When she turned to him, her face glowed with the same warmth it always had. "I'm waiting," she whispered. He woke with tears on his face, but for the first time in a long while, they weren't only tears of sorrow, they carried hope. The following weeks blurred together, marked by small joys and sharp reminders of his limits. Grace came by with her walking cane, teasing him about his poor chess skills. Daniel insisted on reading Arthur's stories aloud, stumbling over words but glowing with pride. Even David, who lived miles away, visited more often, his voice gentler than Arthur remembered, his patience stronger. They all seemed to understand, even if unspoken, that time was no longer generous. One late afternoon, Arthur insisted on being taken to the park where he and Margaret had once spent countless hours walking. Emily wheeled him along the familiar paths, the air rich with the smell of earth and blossoms. Children's laughter floated across the grass, dogs barked happily, and the world pulsed with energy he could no longer join but still cherished. At one point, they stopped by the bench where Margaret used to sit, knitting while he read the newspaper beside her. Arthur's eyes softened as he touched the worn wood. "So many years," he murmured. Emily squeezed his shoulder gently. They sat in silence, the kind that speaks louder than words, watching the sun dip low in the sky. When they returned home, Arthur seemed more at peace, as though some circle had closed. That evening, he took out his notebook, the one filled with his life stories, and added a final line at the bottom of the last page. It didn't get easier, but it was worth every moment. He closed the book and placed it carefully on the nightstand, a quiet gift for those who would remain. A few nights later, Emily found him in bed, breathing softly, a faint smile on his lips. The notebook still rested by his side, his glasses folded neatly on top. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes not with loneliness but with release. She sat beside him for hours, holding his hand, whispering gratitude into the silence, until morning came and with it the certainty that he had slipped away peacefully. In the days that followed, the family gathered. Stories were told, tears shed, laughter shared through the grief. Daniel insisted on reading from Arthur's notebook during the small ceremony. His young voice trembled as he spoke the words his grandfather had written, but he carried them with dignity. Grace attended too, leaning on her cane, her eyes red from crying. She whispered to Emily afterward, "He taught me it was okay to grow old with all the cracks showing." Emily hugged her, knowing Grace's friendship had been a lifeline for her father. As weeks turned into months, the ache of absence softened into something else, not less painful, but quieter, like a scar that no longer bleeds. Emily kept the notebook on her shelf, often opening it late at night to hear her father's voice in the lines. Daniel carried a chess piece in his pocket, a reminder of the games they'd played. And David planted a small tree in his father's memory, its roots gripping the earth, its branches stretching skyward. Arthur's life had not grown easier after 80. In truth, it had become a relentless lesson in surrender, in vulnerability, in facing the fragility of existence. But through it all, he discovered unexpected gifts, new bonds, renewed love, the chance to leave behind more than silence. And so, even as the family grieved, they carried forward his final truth, that life, no matter how difficult, is precious not because it spares us hardship, but because it offers us love to hold on to, memories to treasure, and the courage to let go when the time comes.